Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm here with the Attorney General, Dana Nessel, to talk about the very harmful realities of the legislation under consideration today by the Michigan Senate Elections Committee. First, it's been said often, but it bears repeating. The 2020 election was the most secure and accessible in Michigan's history. We saw more people vote than ever before, over 5.5 million, and we saw more people vote absentee than ever before, over 3.3 million. Our hardworking election officials tabulated every valid vote safely and securely, and more efficiently than even our best predictions would have anticipated. And despite what former candidates or voters unhappy with the results may say, every aspect of the process was secure, and the results were an accurate reflection of the will of the people, as underscored by over 250 audits conducted by my office and the election clerks all around the state. Now, as the state's chief election officer, I've offered public remarks and written testimony in order to provide both lawmakers and the public with an honest, data-informed analysis of the very real, very damaging impact of the now infamous 39 bill voter suppression package that Senate Republicans have proposed. Others have as well, and today we see that public pressure is working. Earlier today, the AARP sent a scathing letter advising the lawmakers on the committee on the harmful impact that two bills would have on our senior citizens. Shortly after that letter was made public, substitutes were introduced to address some of those concerns. So this goes to show that if these bills were developed in consultation with my office, the State Bureau of Elections, or the election experts or election clerks in the state, instead of being a part of a national coordinated partisan strategy to undo the policies that enabled such high voter turnout and success in 2020, these leaders wouldn't need to endure such strong opposition from voters and experts and election administrators. In fact, developing sound election policy should not be a partisan game. It should be a venture based in truth, honesty, facts, data, and a view of how to balance the important and coexisting values of accessible, secure, and fair elections. So I hope legislators will now stop complaining about or even attacking those who are critiquing their legislation and their process, and instead listen to the truth about how much of their proposed legislation is indeed poorly written and makes our system more chaotic, less accessible and secure, and interferes with state and local officials' work to carry out fair, secure, and accessible elections. We've still got a lot of work to do. And I want to now talk briefly about the bevy of proposals being considered today by the Senate Elections Committee. I'll then turn it over to Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, who also has an additional perspective to add as Michigan's Chief Law Enforcement Officer. The proposals before the Senate Elections Committee today largely fall into two categories: those that would deny election administrators the funds they need to carry out elections, and those who would impede citizens' full access to their constitutional right to vote. For over 2 decades now, the state legislature has not provided sufficient funds to run elections in the state of Michigan. Thankfully, the federal government has fulfilled some of its role in that partnership, and last year in particular provided funding to every state to support COVID-related election needs. Now, without that funding, we would not have been able to support safe elections here in Michigan with PPE and other materials that we were able to provide, and we would not have been able to so effectively ensure the security of our absentee voting processes. Yet in an astounding attempted overreach, legislation being considered today seeks to curtail the discretion of election administrators to utilize federal funding. Senate Bill 289 would enable the state legislature to withhold funding from federal election grants, subjecting our ability to do our jobs and run elections to the same partisan ploys we've seen in play in other circumstances. Meanwhile, Senate Bill 284 would prohibit local clerks from accepting funds from third parties for election administration, despite the fact that hundreds of Michigan jurisdictions demonstrated the need for such funding last year for basic functions like hiring election workers and purchasing equipment, because the state legislature or local governments did not provide sufficient funds in 2020. And in combination with restricting the ability to fund elections, we have proposals that would make running elections more expensive, like Senate Bill 307, which would require absentee ballots to be printed and mailed with the entire text of the ballot proposals, as opposed to the summaries that have been used and sufficient for decades. The other set of bills interfere with citizens' ability to vote while hiding under a false banner of election security and voter identification. First, let me be clear. We already have voter identification requirements in Michigan, and our current system of requirements and of identifying voters works. Before any voter in this state can receive a ballot, their identity and eligibility to vote is confirmed via either a photo ID or a signed affidavit. If they vote in person, they must either show an accepted form of identification or sign, under penalty of perjury, an affidavit attesting to their identity. If they vote absentee, the voter's signature or their driver's license number, state ID, or the last 4 digits of the social security number are matched with what's on file before they get a ballot and before that absentee ballot, once returned, is counted. And clerks who question whether a voter's signature ID matches their signature on file must follow up with the voter to reaffirm or affirm their identity. These existing voter identification provisions are time-tested and effective. Adding additional identification, even if they're options, has no additional security impact, but increases the possibility of identity theft and makes it harder for eligible citizens to vote. And yet today's substitute version of Senate Bill 285 still includes an additional identification option for absentee voters, inviting them to submit a photocopy of their ID through the mail in order to get their absentee ballot. That this is now optional only underscores that it is unnecessary and does nothing to increase the security of our elections. The existing multiple identification requirements for absentee voters are already sufficient at both confirming a voter's identity and identifying any fraud. What this proposal does do is create confusion and challenges for clerks and voters, including exposing Michigan citizens to identity theft, which the AARP letter highlights and which our Attorney General will expand on. Senate Bills 303 and 304 would force anyone who arrives at their polling place without an ID to vote with a provisional ballot, which would only be counted if that eligible voter is later able to prove and provide proof of their ID to their local clerk. Now, already, 99% of citizens who vote at their polling place present a photo ID. The handful who don't identify themselves by completing a signed affidavit under penalty of perjury, which is then stored and maintained with other election records. This bill would do nothing more than disenfranchise those voters. The fact is that our current ID laws in Michigan work and are part of a robust, secure system to ensure that only eligible citizens are able to cast ballots in our elections. There is absolutely no evidence that this legislation would build on those current security protocols to increase the integrity of the system. But there is considerable evidence that they would make it more difficult for clerks to run elections and more confusing and challenging for eligible citizens to vote. All this suggests just one conclusion. These bills are not an effort to combat voter fraud. They are an effort to reduce voter turnout. Now, finally, in previous hearings, committee members spoke about people losing faith in our elections. I want to address that briefly. The reality is that our elections are safe, secure, and accurate. If any voter has lost faith in that, it's not because the system is flawed. It's because leaders have deceived them into thinking that it is, and then allowed those lies to spread and be repeated and amplified. But that doesn't change the truth about the security of our elections, nor does it change any current leader's responsibility to tell that truth. On that note, I'll hand it over to Attorney General Dana Nessel.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. And thank you so much, Secretary Benson, for inviting me to be here and join you today to talk about the increased risk of identity theft brought about by this legislation. So my department has investigated multiple claims of voter fraud and even charged some individuals with crimes for attempting to commit voter fraud. But ultimately, we never found evidence of fraud anywhere near a scale that would have ever impacted the outcome of the election. In the aftermath of November, we can confirm with absolute confidence that Michigan experienced a safe and secure election cycle. Now, a number of frivolous lawsuits were filed, including one in Antrim County just recently dismissed by Judge Elsenheimer. And despite the unsuccessful lawsuits and lack of evidence of fraud, we are now forced to combat legislation that limits Michiganders' ability to vote and puts them at greater risk to become victims of identity theft. My office, the Department of Attorney General, devotes a team within our Consumer Protection Division known as Michigan Identity Theft Support, or MITS, to help people prevent and recover from identity theft. And thank God we did, because it's far easier to prevent identity theft than it is to recover once you've been the victim, have had your identity stolen. And that's really one of the most frightening aspects of Senate Bill 285. And while we did receive word shortly before this event that a substitution to the bill is being finalized, it still includes the option for an individual to send a copy of their ID to the local clerk when requesting an absentee ballot by mail. Sending personally identifiable information through the mail, especially a copy of any kind of state ID, absolutely increases an individual's chances of being victimized. This legislation is basically mandating Michigan voters put their identities at risk in order to vote absentee. The obvious vulnerability here is mail theft. This could be mail theft by an individual, a postal worker, or an organization. And as part of our partnership with the Federal Trade Commission, my office knows all too well that stolen mail containing personally identifiable information, or PII, can be used in organized or in individual identity theft scams. In fact, in 2020 alone, there were a total of 24,370 identity theft complaints here in Michigan. And through the first quarter of 2021, we've already received a total of 6,467 complaints. Now, in addition to theft, mail delays with your personal information out there can also be very concerning to the sender. And God knows we've had a lot of problems with mail delays. Furthermore, we need to remember that there are people who don't have secure access to, say, a photo copier machine or a scanner of some sort in their home. And because of that, they may be forced to use libraries or copy centers to comply in the event this legislation were to become law. But of course, copying an ID in a public machine brings with it its own host of concerns that further opens up an individual to identity theft. My office and other AGs across the nation, along with the Federal Trade Commission, know for certain that anytime personal information is being collected and sent, there's an increased risk that confidentiality may be compromised. And let me say this, that includes this new substitute bill, because ultimately what we're talking about is having to send information that already contains your name and your address and other information, along with additional identifiers that, as Secretary Benson indicated, is not necessary and is duplicative of the information, of course, that the Secretary of State or the clerk's office will already have. So I encourage every Michigander who's watching today to really reflect on how you voted in the last election. So if you're one of the millions of residents who requested your absentee ballot by mail and voted by mail, do you really want that process to become more difficult? And do you really feel comfortable mailing a copy of your driver's license, or any of your personal information at all in the mail around election time that is going to your clerk's office and can be easily taken out of your mailbox by somebody who knows that that's what they're going to find in many people's mailbox around the time of the election? So all of this is a ridiculous concept, and I would urge our legislators not to even consider doing such a thing. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone, and thank you, Secretary Benson, for your tireless work, and I'll turn things back over to you.
Thank you, Attorney General Nessel. Now we have some limited time for questions from the media here today.
Clara Hendrickson with Detroit Free Press, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Clara.
Clara, I'm not sure if you unmuted yourself, but we're not hearing you yet.
Can you hear me now?
There we go.
All right, thanks so much. So I have two quick questions. The first is that the House is voting on two bills that would increase the penalties related to absentee ballot application fraud. Wondering where you both stand on those pieces of legislation. And then my second question is whether you are concerned about poll worker recruitment heading into 2022, given the current political climate and proposals that would increase the number of challengers and give them new powers.
I'll take those. I think on a second piece on election workers, our office worked with local election administrators to recruit over 30,000 new election workers, and they're really the lifeblood of our democracy. And it's important that they know the rules. It's important that they are committed to the integrity of the process. And we've done a lot of work as well to increase their capacity and knowledge base there. So I've already spoken about some of the proposals to have an increase, a significant increase, as some of them do, to partisan challengers. I think transparency is important, but it's a balance between protecting that transparency and openness of the process, which we've consistently had, with the potential for interference or confusion or any type of even intimidation. And in addition to that, you also have the challenge oftentimes of folks coming in who don't know the process and then therefore make misinterpretations on what they observe. And we saw this in many ways as misinformation spread in the days, weeks, and months following the October 2020 election. So I think any proposals, and again, I've already weighed in on some of the specifics that have been discussed, and that existing proposals have to protect our election workers. And my office is continuing to recruit election workers with our local clerks, and then have to allow for transparency and informed challengers to be able to observe the process while having protections for voters and election workers against any type of intervention or chaos or anything worse than that. Regarding your first question with regards to the bills in the House right now, my office is looking at them specifically, and there has been some back and forth and some discussion about them. I stand firm in saying we need to look at data and legislate off of that, not in furtherance of a policy or partisan agenda. And where the data shows there needs to be improvements, my office has supported them. Where the changes are actually in furtherance of misinformation and unnecessary, as some of the bills we've talked about today, we have stood to simply respond by talking about the truth of the impact of the bills and educate the public and hopefully other lawmakers about them. So we're going to continue to do that, and I appreciate the added focus that so many folks in the media have had as well on these bills as they made it through the House and the Senate. And my office will continue to be actively involved in hopefully trying to continue to work with legislators to ensure that any bills proposed that are enacted ultimately reflect what voters want and need and what our election administrators are calling for.
Secretary, do you mind if I add on to that?
Go for it.
So firstly, in terms of increased penalties for voter fraud, I have never before in my career seen an instance where there's the need to increase penalties for a crime that we practically never see. Every single instance where there was alleged voter fraud, and when I mean alleged voter fraud, I don't mean just people saying the election was stolen. I mean where there were specific examples where a clerk contacted us or someone else about an irregularity. The Secretary of State and myself, we investigated each and every one of those occurrences. Now, I'm not going to say that it never happened, but it very, very rarely happens. And when it does, almost every time you get caught. I mean, there are so many layers of review, it's almost impossible to get away with voter fraud. So here's the thing. I mean, in theory, do higher penalties, do more significant or more stringent penalties make sense? I don't know. First, you'd have to identify why there's a problem with what we have in place. And you haven't. I think this is just a scare tactic. When we haven't had any issues to begin with, why increase the penalties? It doesn't make sense unless you really had wide-scale voter fraud. And we know for a fact that we don't. So it's not a problem. And I don't know why this has to be addressed in the scheme of all the things going on in our state that really should be addressed and aren't. But furthermore, in terms of the recruitment of election workers, given these new proposals in terms of how many people can be challengers and all the rest of it, I'm going to say this. I knew many people that volunteered of their time to work at TCF Center, and they told me that given those circumstances that they had to endure, they would never ever do it again. They were terrified. What we saw at TCF in terms of the way that people were trying to intimidate and scream at and yell at and threaten election workers, I mean, absolutely, it is not a tenable set of circumstances. And in my opinion, some of the people that were there that were threatening and intimidating the election workers perhaps should have been prosecuted. So, you know, we're setting up a set of circumstances where you're allowing the terrorization of people who are simply, you know, volunteering to assist in an important process that's essential to maintaining our democracy. And so that's why it's concerning to me.
Jonathan Osting with Bridge, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. I think this question is primarily for Attorney General Nessel. I'm curious if you think eliminating the affidavit option to vote without an ID in person is even constitutional. As you probably know, the Michigan Supreme Court in 2007 upheld the current law in part because it had that affidavit option. It said it didn't amount to a poll tax because you didn't have to, pay for an ID or drive to get one if you could do the affidavit instead.
Well, Jonathan, I can't say that I've done a comprehensive analysis of it, but I will say I am very concerned that there are a number of areas of the proposed legislation that are unconstitutional. And I think it's likely that if some of this gets through, certainly if all of it gets through, that there will be some very valid constitutional challenges that we'll be facing as a result. I will say whoever drafted these bills seemingly was very unconcerned with whether they were constitutional or not.
Peg McNichol, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
So you've mentioned finding minor cases of fraud. Can you put a number on that for the 2016 election? I did report one story out of Canton where I think a guy tried to register his dog or something. How many actual cases of fraud did you all identify from just the 2016 general election?
For myself, I wasn't in office in 2016, so I can't tell you what the Department of Attorney General did or did not do. I knew I had heard that there were a handful of cases of seniors that had accidentally voted twice, and they had determined that it was unintentional in all those instances, but I wasn't in office in 2016, so I really can't answer that question.
Walt Sorg, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
There we go.
Walt, we're still not hearing you. Please unmute yourself.
There we go. Sorry about that. I apologize. This is for Secretary Benson. I got on a little bit late, so you may have already answered this. You spoke out recently against the bill which would arbitrarily cut off the counting of ballots, even if all the votes hadn't been counted. Based on your experiences last year, how many counties would that impact if it were in effect?
That's a great question. I actually want to first respond to the previous question briefly and just say I think there's actually been a lot of research done on, and a lot of folks have tried to find incidents of fraud in both 2016 and 2020, and so we can get you some of that research that's been done and some of those details and those data points, but again, it's been I think widely covered, and also so we want to emphasize that it's infinitesimal. As we've said consistently, and the specific numbers are available, and we can get that to you. In regards to your question, Walt, there were a number of, I was very pleased with the efficiency with which the ballots were tabulated following the November 2020 election. If you recall, the unofficial results were completed about 24 hours after the polls closed, about 8 or 9 p.m. on the day after the election. The current bill would halt this count at noon, the day after the election. In particular, from what I recall, And again, this is something we could get you more specific data on, but I hesitate to even recollect. Certainly Detroit and Flint and Kalamazoo, I believe, as well as I believe Grand Rapids, essentially the most populous locations in the state that have the most number of ballots to tabulate and had the most and largest numbers of absentee ballots were in that list. And so you're really just talking about the most populous communities in our states being impacted. And I would also emphasize two things. One, that data point, that number is going to change from election to election. And a lot of times if a machine breaks down or if someone doesn't show up to count ballots or if there are other problems, that also can slow down the tabulation process. And that's why a deadline that results be reported at noon, which the law very clearly says, and that Senator Bumstead's mailing reiterates and even brags about, is particularly problematic. And again, it really serves no other purpose other than to cause confusion and potentially lead to the uncounting or non-tabulation of valid votes. And then the final thing I'll just say is if this bill is emerging from a sentiment that we should have results of our elections sooner than 24 hours after Election Day, for example, then the solution is clear. It's not this. The solution is to allow our clerks time to pre-process absentee ballots prior to Election Day. That's indeed why other states were able to so efficiently, more efficiently than Michigan, tabulate their votes in November. So if that is the intent behind this, or if there are other intents behind this that are less about interfering with democracy and more about good government, we're happy to offer substituted language or other policies that would actually enable the efficient counting of the process. But we're not going to do anything or support anything that would artificially stop the tabulation of valid votes or lead to any valid vote in Michigan to not be counted.
And I will say, if you're talking about evaluating these from a constitutional standpoint, for an individual who has voted legally, for their vote not to count because of some of the reasons that Secretary Benson has indicated, because of this fixed arbitrary deadline as to when it has to be counted, I will say there is no way that is going to pass constitutional muster. You are literally setting up the state to be sued and setting up these counties to be sued in a way that is, that law to me is virtually indefensible. And I mean, I don't know who evaluated that law before it was drafted, or that proposed piece of legislation, but it's ridiculous in every way, shape, and form, and it's absolutely unconstitutional. I will say that right now.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. We've hit 2:00 and we have to cut off, but have a good day and be in touch if you need anything else.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.